Hello. Welcome to the Mental Health Bar with me, Chris PG. I am joined this week by the wonderful Phoebe Webb, who you can see to my right here, podcaster and writer. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things. We've been having a nice little chat beforehand. We're quite similar people. We've discovered we're creative and have a number of different things that we've got with in our brains. But more specifically, we're going to be talking about eating disorders this week, which is not a topic I've covered before, Phoebe. I know that you when I did this, I obviously put out an email saying, I put out a tweet saying, hey, I'd like people who are coping with mental health or coping with things or have overcome or not overcome something. I don't like the term overcome because, like we discussed, that you're always going. It's always there. It's always in the background. And you replied on Twitter and said, I'd love to come on and talk about eating disorders because not something a lot of people talk about. You don't see a lot of people. And you, I believe at the time you said you'd spoken about it on the BBC.
Yeah, so because I've been an ambassador with Beat. So Beat is the UK's leading eating disorder charity.
Yeah.
And I've been an ambassador with them since 2017. So I've done various bits of media. So I've done BBC and ITV, a few segments with them. I made a short film as well with the charity Fixers a few years ago.
Okay.
So I've dabbled.
You've dabbled in the
Yeah.
media. And what made you see? What did you want to do? Why were you talking about it a bit more openly than obviously a lot of people find these subjects very taboo? So what made you reach out to those kind of organisations?
There are so many reasons that is just kind of flooding to my head to try and figure out which one to say first. So I'd suffered with anorexia since I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling like I was abnormal in that I had an eating disorder, but I wasn't doing it in a pursuit of beauty. And I assumed that's what everyone else with eating disorders did.
Yeah.
And then I remember saying my parents drove me to hospital, psychiatric hospital on my 17th birthday. And I remember saying to them, I'm going to be the only one who's not doing it to be pretty. And I could not have been more wrong. So,
Okay.
I was living with an eating disorder and I had so little knowledge about it myself.
Yeah.
Even though, over the months preceding that, I had been doing so much research into eating disorders to convince myself I didn't have one.
Right. Yeah.
But I really learned so much about it from my fellow patients.
Yes.
And, I was in hospital for other issues as well as my eating disorder, and I had quite a grasp and quite an insight into my OCD and the subsequent depression that came with that. But yeah, the eating disorder side of things was, I had no idea. So, and then as the years went on, it really developed in different ways and it took different forms. And I started my recovery when I was 21.
Yeah.
And one of the things that kept me on the straight and narrow, if you will, was the idea of helping other people who have been through it, whether that be people with the illnesses themselves or the loved ones of those.
Yeah.
And also, I'd faced so much adversity and people not understanding, and the amount of people putting their foot in it when they were talking to me.
Yes.
That and it's so distressing that I didn't want other people to have those experiences, and so I didn't want my troubles to have happened in vain, if that makes sense.
No, that makes absolute sense.
I took it to working with, to start with Beat once I was well enough to do so. And even when I've gone through rougher patches in my recovery, because let's be honest, it's never just like a nice straight line. I've got that incentive.
Yeah.
Because campaigning means so much to me that I have to be well to do it.
Yes.
So if recovery is feeling harder sometimes, which it does, it's nice to have an extra reason that's also not just based on myself, because sometimes in recovery you have to be selfish. You do have to do it for yourself, but to do it for others, whether it be directly for your family or friends, to do it for a wider good is a really good motivation for me.
I think it's a good. I think you either have to do it. So I read a thing where it said you either have to survive for you or survive for yourself, and those are the only things you can't do it. Sorry, survive for you or survive for someone else, because you can't do it for surviving for an organization or surviving for a thing you're going to buy or a holiday you're going to go on. It's always surviving for you living, or it's absolutely the same thing to survive for someone else. A lot of people, like parents, have got through suicidal tendencies for their kids, and they've got through a lot of different things for their kids. So you made a good point back there, is that you went in saying that you're the only person doing this because you're not pretty. You were the only person with a because you're not pretty, not because you're not pretty. That's not what I mean. Because you're not trying to be pretty, and you were wrong about that. So because I think the media portrays eating disorders as only, like, that's where you get that impression from, is only people trying to be thin for the way they look. So what would you say, why do you think it happened? We dive straight in here. I wasn't expecting us to get straight to the core, but what would you say was the main reason for you?
Primarily because I was always an anxious child, as we just discussed before we started. I was diagnosed with ADHD last year, but ADHD is something you grow up with. It's not something you develop as a teenager or an adult. It's always there because it's just the way your brain is.
Yes.
So the way I described it the other day was that I was high achieving but chaotic.
High achieving but chaotic.
Internally. Yeah. So, I did really well in school, in primary school, and I loved school and I loved to learn. But something was, in retrospect, was amiss. And I was always a very anxious kid. And then when I was 11, we moved to a new area. I went to a school where I didn't know anyone and I was bullied, and I developed OCD. And between the ages of 12 and 15, the OCD got increasingly severe, to the point where it absolutely controlled my life. All of my life was compulsions. So I was just performing rituals for hours at a time, up to, at my worst, probably about 12 hours a day I spent doing rituals. And I had big fears about contamination. And another weird, this is going to sound weird, and I wrote about this when I talked about OCD-induced psychosis, in that I had to keep the world in balance.
Right.
I didn't have a specific motivation for my rituals and compulsions, but it was very unsafe to not do them.
Right.
And it was a big responsibility. And having that overtake my life, I realized over time that I started controlling what I ate and my weight. And it wasn't a matter of, I want to be thinner in order to look a certain way. If anything, I wanted to look horrific. I wanted to look so ill as proof that I was doing my eating disorder well, because my eating disorder was something to achieve. Weight loss was something to achieve. The way I'd achieved academically when I was younger and stopped achieving because of my mental health, I could control things and I could achieve things through anorexia.
So it was more about, it was definitely about 100% a control issue. I think it's always a control issue, but for you it was a ritual. So I think, that's a very good point, because again, people don't see that aspect of it. They just see I'm trying to get into a dress, I'm trying to look like Brad Pitt, I'm trying to do that. And now we're discovering more and more, because obviously in the past when we were, I don't know, I say we, but I think I'm 10 years older than you at least, but when in the past, in the 80s and 90s, it was very much women got bulimia and anorexia, and now we're seeing that it's much more evenly spread. But it's very much a control thing. And someone's just made a good point in the chat. Clara said that she's a binge eater, which I think is probably the opposite of control, and actually overeating is an eating disorder as much as undereating, and people don't talk about that at all.
Absolutely. So last week was Eating Disorders Awareness Week, and the theme for it was actually binge eating disorder. Right. And so I know a few statistics on binge eating disorder. It was only put in the DSM in 2013.
Wow.
And before then, so it's really, at least the terminology is recent, the condition isn't recent.
No.
And before then, it was bracketed with eating disorder not otherwise specified, which was basically if you don't have anorexia or bulimia, you have eating disorder not otherwise specified. So
Yeah.
that was from 1994. So it started being recognised in 1994. It wasn't its own diagnosis till 2013. So it took nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
But binge eating disorder is the most common eating disorder diagnosis and the least talked about. So anorexia accounts for 8 to 10% of people
Right.
with eating disorders.
8 to
Bulimia
10.
is 8 to 10, that's it. Bulimia is about 40% and is also hugely misunderstood as to what bulimia actually is. But BED is about 50% of all people with EDs.
So an eating 50%. So we're talking about the other side of the spectrum, because obviously when someone says eating disorder, you think bulimia, you think anorexia. What someone else has made, Steve has made a good point in the chat that it's conflated with body dysmorphia all the time rather than control. And you're saying 50% binge eating disorder is that's
and
a crazy statistic.
I want to really stress that binge eating is the main characteristic of bulimia.
Right.
Whereas people think purging is what characterizes bulimia, and it's not. The main thing is the binge eating and the compensatory behaviors that come with that. But as someone who had a primarily restrictive eating disorder, I went through a binge and restrict cycle as well.
Right.
And that really isn't talked about. I spent years in and out of intensive treatment in hospitals and day patient with other people with eating disorders, and binge eating was so taboo. So maybe I was the only one in those groups to have experienced it, but I highly doubt it. I think everyone was just too ashamed to admit to it, because with diet culture as well, and in our country, diet culture wreaks havoc through everyone. Binge eating is associated with like a lack of control or greediness, and it's so much. There are so many aspects to binge eating, and for me personally, part of it felt like a lack of control, but in a way I was still controlling something, because I was controlling what was going into my body, and I was controlling it in a way that I was trying to harm myself. My binge eating was self-harm, because I knew how physically and mentally how awful I would feel afterwards. And I'm sure there are going to be people who hear this and relate and think maybe they are just greedy or lazy, but there's so much to BED that isn't discussed because of fat phobia and because of the shame around, oh well, you shouldn't eat more than you need to.
Well, and you shouldn't eat this, or you shouldn't eat that, or this will make you look a certain way, and how you appear. Like I know that so I was an overeater. I recently took control of that, but I was an overeater, and I got to 26 stone. I got to quite big, and it was about eating instead of feeling. So instead of like feeling sad, I'd go and eat, because it was easier, because I couldn't control the sadness, but I could eat a packet of biscuits or whatever, I could just go crazy.
It's a distraction, and it can also, you can feel, if you feel apathetic, if you feel metaphorically empty, if you feel like there is a void within you, whether that be literally from restriction or figuratively, you can fill it with food temporarily. And I totally relate to that. And I still, I don't restrict anymore and I don't binge anymore, but I am prone to comfort eating.
Yes.
And which is a real battle in my head. Because it's not like the anorexia in me has completely gone. So sometimes it's like, oh, I want to eat all of this stuff because I'm sad. But then the other part of me is just like, don't be ridiculous, don't be disgusting, have some control. And it's kind of contradictory, really.
So, well, let's look. Let's see what you did. What did you do? How did you take? You said 21 years old. I don't. How long ago was that? If you don't mind me asking.
Um,
If you do
it will
tell
be
me.
7 years this year.
7 years.
7 years.
So,
So
hey, I was right. We're 10 years between. I was like, bang on, bang on. So tell me, what 7 years? Great, fantastic.
Near enough, yeah.
What did you do? What was the thing that? What was the turning point, and what have you done to work on that?
I think there were a lot of mini moments before the actual change. So, like I said, I went into hospital when I was 17 on my birthday, and was in for 5 months.
Right.
And then I had a brief stint in a different hospital just before I turned 18. And
Right.
then when I was 20, I did a very brief stint in an eating disorder day patient program. And I think I might have done 2 days before saying, I'm not doing this because I don't want to recover. And then a few months after, so in 2013, I went back into hospital specifically for my eating disorder. I was there for 6 months that time.
Yeah.
Came out, did day patient again, left day patient, relapsed, went back to day patient. And I was, basically bumping around between different therapists and different psychiatrists and different forms of treatment, and whether or not, it's really hard to get eating disorder treatment as well. You really have to be very underweight for starters, which is ridiculous because, like we said, if the minority of people with eating disorders have anorexia, and yet in order to get eating disorder treatment, you need to be underweight, that doesn't add up. But that's sadly how it is and still is now. You really have to jump through hoops to get treatment. And then, in my experience, I didn't want treatment by the time they were offering it to me.
No.
Because my eating disorder is such a big part of my life. But so I was in day patient, and again by this point, and I had a partner at the time, and he basically said, I can't deal with you and your eating disorder anymore. I don't know who you are anymore, because it did encompass my whole personality and my whole identity.
Yeah.
And a combination of that, and then also feeling my body was not handling things as well as it once did. Because, the longer you put this stress on your body, the more frail you're going to become.
Yeah, of course.
And I was 21, but I was weak, and all I thought about was either food or what I could do to compensate for what I did eat. And it was just so overwhelming. And I think after that amount of time, I was like, I can't handle this anymore. I don't want to live like this anymore, but I also don't know how to change.
Yeah.
And it was a terrifying thought, because, like I said, I relied on my eating disorder to form my personality almost. I was so scared that if I didn't have my eating disorder, that I would be a shell, basically.
Yeah.
And I couldn't have been more wrong, because I was the shell when I was unwell.
Yes.
Because
it becomes you.
Yeah. And over the last nearly 7 years, well, 6.5 at the moment, I think, I have filled that what I thought was I've developed who I am. I was kind of in a way stunted as a teenager when I became unwell, and they're such formative years as well, and I kind of skipped that. So it was in my 20s that I started figuring out who I was, and realizing there was more to me than mental illness as well. It was a big challenge. I was underweight, and I was physically unwell, and I did have to have physical observations done on a regular basis. But I remember, before I started refeeding of my own decision rather than being forced to in treatment, I did so much research into how are you meant to recover? What are you supposed to eat? 'Cause I'm so detached from what regular eating, intuitive eating was.
Yeah.
That I genuinely didn't know what I was supposed to eat and how much. And I remember asking a dietitian, and she gave me a ridiculous answer that even I knew was far too little food. I think I've shouted at a lot of dietitians in my time.
No, is there any pleasant dietitians? If you're a pleasant dietitian, please do get in touch with the show. But I haven't experienced.
I've had experience with one dietitian I got on with, and she was really knowledgeable and on the ball. But a lot of dietitians don't train specifically in eating disorders, and therefore don't know a lot about them and how to tackle that relationship a patient would have with food. And I know someone who, spoke to a doctor about having binge eating disorder, and they were just like, "You're eating too much." It's like, yeah.
Yeah,
kind of what I'm here to talk about.
cool.
And the solution for a lot of people when they ask for treatment for BED is, oh, just diet and exercise.
Yeah, we talked about this just before.
There's really not getting to the root of the issue.
No,
eating disorders have so many layers, and finding that core issue, for some it might be childhood trauma, it could be grief, it could be substance issues. There are so many things that can lend to the development of an eating disorder, and I think it's really important to mention a predisposition as well, because you could have two people, even siblings, even with a predisposition, one with a predisposition, one with not. They have the same upbringing, and potentially the same traumas, but only one of them develops the eating disorder. The other one may develop other unhealthy coping mechanisms. But if you have a predisposition for an eating disorder, plus a trigger, plus diet culture, it's a pretty bleak outlook. And that was definitely me.
Well, yeah. And people don't see, the thing is, people think of the eating disorder as the problem rather than a symptom of the problem. And
absolutely.
I think, well, that's what doctors do, is they often say, like you say, you go to a dietitian with an eating disorder, that's not really what's supposed to, that's not what they're there for. They're not for that. They're there to, I'm not really sure what dietitians are for when it comes to that, but I was taken to one when I was 13 because I was overweight, and that set a precedent for, like, being 13 and being told you have to eat brown bread and brown rice. And I was like, I don't know if that's why I'm eating a packet of burgers at a time. I think it's probably not going to change if you're going to. But again, it's I think we focused on it. So that was what happened. That was the moment. You went to see people. They weren't very helpful. You've obviously made a decision. What were the things that you said you learned to eat properly? But what did you do? What are the little things you did? Because I always find it's the small things that people did. For me, it was running, for example, that really helped.
Well, I definitely couldn't do that. Because
no, but it was the mentality of it. It was just not a big long race, but getting one step at a time.
Yeah, it really was. It really was a matter of doing little things, and for some, it may be helpful to have a long-term goal, but that wasn't something that was effective for me.
No.
So I needed to focus on the small things, partially because I didn't know what my long-term goals were. And I suppose a lot of people around the age of 21, 22 don't know what their long-term goals are.
No.
So yeah, like I said, it was very much the small things, even if it just be a matter of, I want to eat this particular food again. I miss this food. I want to put that in, as maybe like a little goalpost. So it was small things, and then every so often there'd be like a bigger gesture, or a bigger milestone. Like, it might not sound big depending on the context, but the time I decided I was not having skimmed milk anymore, and I ceremoniously poured it down the sink, and have not had it since.
Ceremony. What did you replace it with? Whole milk, or did you?
I went to semi-skimmed milk. I've also, because my eating disorder really kind of messed with my digestive system, that I can't really eat dairy anymore anyway. And that's something that is kind of bleak to me, because it's just like, when I wasn't eating properly, my body was very unhappy. Now I do eat properly, and my body's still not that happy, because it can, there's very little I can eat without it playing up. But I also can't pander to that restriction, because otherwise it would appease the eating disorder. So it's a real balancing act I'm going to eat this, and I'm going to be in pain afterwards, but that's preferable to having to restrict my diet so much again.
Yeah.
So that's very common as well. I know so many people have been through eating disorders and recovery who have then gone on to have digestive problems.
Well, you haven't
So
taught your body, have you? You have to teach your body. People
yeah,
don't realise that what you do when you're younger affects the development later, and you can teach your body just to not know how to deal with it. It just doesn't know how to deal with it.
yeah, development is a good thing to bring up actually as well, because most people who develop eating disorders do so in their teen years,
Yeah.
much like I did. And if it goes untreated, and it goes into adulthood, there's also that fundamental development that most healthy teenagers go through to go from being a child into an adult. And if your development is interrupted by malnutrition, you kind of have to, your adult body develops in your 20s or later, when your peers have all they've done that, been there, done that. And it really contributes to that unstable body image.
Yes.
Because for me, even now, I'm just like, why don't I have my pre-eating disorder body? And the reason I don't have my pre-eating disorder body in recovery is because I was a child then.
Yes.
And how many people have the same body at 28 as they did at 14?
No.
It's natural, and that's something I've really had to come to terms with. And speaking of, I know someone mentioned body dysmorphia. I think we need to say that not everyone with body dysmorphia has an eating disorder, and not everyone with an eating disorder has body dysmorphia.
No.
And because body dysmorphia really is its own illness with its own symptoms. Of course, there is a lot of overlap. And I struggle with unstable self-image because of my eating disorder and because of my BPD. So there is a relationship between those things. But BDD is an anxiety disorder related to OCD.
Right. Is it what? I didn't know body dysmorphia disorder is related to OCD.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
It has because a lot of people with BDD form such compulsive rituals, but around their appearance. And that can translate into eating and their weight as well, of course. But for example, I don't have BDD, but I have trichotillomania, so I've pulled my hair out since I was a kid. And when in the worst times, I've had big bald patches and everything, and that's a very common symptom with BDD, along with dermatillomania, which is skin picking, and then obviously nail biting is a very common thing associated with anxiety, but also boredom. It's nail biting is very normal, for lack of a better word. But they're all body focused repetitive behaviors which are then associated with BDD. And it's that same compulsion you get with OCD, just focused on the body.
See, I wouldn't have even, without you pointing out the connection, I would now you've pointed out, I see what you mean, but I wouldn't have even made the connection with it, because of the way because of the way I've been conditioned through society, that I don't really see them as being the same issues. But you make a very valid point, and I think that people who have those things would now be able to, because it must be easier to find therapy for OCD than it would be for body dysmorphia disorder, for example. It would just, is that the case, or is that, I'd assume it was the case, but
I've not had successful treatment for OCD. It was my primary diagnosis. It's what triggered my problems with my eating disorder, amongst other things. And it was very distressing and time consuming. But in saying that my OCD is mild now, hasn't been through treatment and therapy. It's been through medication and my brain basically taking its foot off the pedal a bit, and it's just naturally muted over time with my medication. With OCD, you're pretty much guaranteed to be prescribed cognitive behavioral therapy. And well, of all the people I've known being treated for mental health, at least with the NHS, CBT is the answer to everything, because it's the cheapest fix-all approach.
Yeah.
But from my experience, CBT could be effective, or could be more effective, if introduced earlier.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, by the time my parents realized my OCD wasn't just me being annoying around the house, by the time I was, with CAMS when I was 16, by that point, CBT was not the answer for me, because it's very behavior focused. It's in the name, and it's very much change your behavior rather than where has this behavior come from and what does it relate to. And also, the idea of the same I had for my eating disorder, the same for my OCD. It was to give up those behaviors was terrifying, because they kept me safe. And they kept the world safe, because in doing all of my rituals, I prevented bad things from happening.
And well, I don't want to go in. I wouldn't. Well, I was just about to say, and what were those bad things? But I don't want to go into those unless you want to.
And there wasn't anything specific for me. Some people do have specific things, like they need to prevent a loved one from dying by doing these very unrelated rituals. Whereas for me, it was just, I don't know why I have to, but I do. And I can't risk not doing them. And then it got to a point when I was just before I turned 18 and I was in college. A classmate of mine who I'd never spoken to, but she was in one of my classes, she got killed in a road traffic accident, and she was 16. And this was, I'd been in hospital at that point. So, and my OCD was still bad. My eating was somewhat under control at that point, but the OCD was still severe. And I felt, by having not died by suicide or by my eating disorder, I had ruined the balance of the world, and she died in my place. So
putting
that
on yourself at 16.
That resulted in another hospital admission, because I felt like in order to avenge her death, I then had to die. It's all very dark, and this was 10 years ago last month, which prompted me to write about the OCD-induced psychosis, because of the delusions I was experiencing relating to my OCD and having thrown out the balance of the world. And it's very much delusions of grandeur almost, because it's just like my little existence threw the world out of balance. It's I say it now and it sounds ridiculous, but it was so real at the time.
Well, yeah, of course it was, because it's a delusion, isn't it? It's part of, we haven't talked about it. You've mentioned it a couple of times. But we discussed before we started the show that you also have, like we said, OCD, but ADHD and BPD, borderline personality disorder, and perhaps we were talking about how they're probably all overlapping as well.
Yeah.
And so there's a delusion there which will come from things like the BPD, and then that'll overlap with the OCD, with the need for the ritual, and then the eating disorder becomes a syndrome of that. And I don't think I think we're only just starting to realize how you can have a layered mental health disorder. Like it's a different...
they are so. I was going to say so often interlinked, but I think they are always. There's always some crossover. And mine was so braided together, especially at that point 10 years ago. Also because it wasn't just my eating disorder that was my identity. BPD has, one of the symptoms of BPD is a lack of sense of self and struggles with identity. So the BPD and the eating disorder and the OCD were all who I was.
Yes.
And they made me who I was. They made me what, in my head, I wanted to be individual, which, hindsight, not really. They're pretty commonly comorbid, those three.
Well, yeah.
It didn't make me special, but I think where earlier I talked about being a high achiever when I was a kid, I started wanting to be I ended up being a high achiever in mental illness. And my psychiatrist on my second hospital admission said, "You've become an expert at being mentally ill," because I didn't know anything else. I had so much insight, but the insight didn't lend itself to recovery.
No.
Insight can be really damning in that way. Like, on one hand, some people may not know how unwell they are, but people around me found my insight almost annoying. Like, how can you know all of this stuff about your illness and still not change?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just like a bit overwhelmed, because that's what I've got the same problem. Is that
Yes.
I can, because I've had it for so long. You walk into a therapist, and often they don't know what they're talking about, because therapists are often just therapists. They go back to, they're not a psychologist, they're not a psychotherapist, they're not a doctor, they're a nurse who's been trained in CBT or something like that, and then they report back to a medic or a psychologist. And I have been told that I just have to walk in and go, "We need to do this, and this. We're starting at this point. It's been a couple of years, and now I haven't needed therapy, but now I do." And it's crazy to go into, like, I've just you saying it. I'm like, I've had that exact thing happen, where they're like,
Yeah.
why? How can you know so much about your mental health, but not be able to overcome it? And you're like, because knowing about a thing doesn't mean I know a phone. I don't know how to fix a phone. I can use it,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
I could show
That's a good
my
way of
mum how
putting
to set up email. It doesn't mean I know how that works.
it.
But
Yeah, when I think too deeply about technology, it scares me. Even though I use it every day, it's just like, oh, let's not think too deeply about it, because how on earth does that work? Like, how does a CD even work? And we've moved on from that.
it's too late. I can tell you, no, I don't want to do that. That's what I'm joking. But it's crazy, because you become an expert, like you were saying, and then it almost becomes harder and harder to help you, because you're convincing yourself out of the diagnosis, right? Or you're convincing, you can
Yeah.
find yourself a
It's a
way around the therapy.
neurosis, even, like, having that insight and obsessing over your diagnoses, that's a new neuroticism,
Yes.
because it's just an extra thing to be obsessed with, especially
Yes.
as someone with OCD. Um, that kind of lent itself to my attachment to my diagnoses, I think.
Right. Right. What, just helped it get worse, or helped it
Yeah,
become
yeah,
another thing?
because I've put so much time and energy into thinking about my mental health problems and researching my mental health problems. Like, because when I was diagnosed with BPD 10 years ago, I'd never heard of it,
Yes, you said. Yeah.
and initially ignored it. Then when I started researching it, it was like, oh my God, I became a little bit obsessed and hyper focused on it. And then more recently, although I was diagnosed with ADHD last summer
Right.
officially,
Yeah.
it's a long process to get the diagnosis. And it started with a friend of mine with ADHD saying, "I think you've got ADHD," because it's not something you necessarily think, because it's another thing, it's another disorder or condition that is misunderstood.
Yes.
Um, I didn't think for myself that's what I have. I just thought I was, incapable of a lot of
Yeah.
stuff. Um, but the same thing happened when my friend says, "I think you have ADHD," because the research started and the obsession started
Yeah.
into have I've got an explanation for this, but I still can't fix it with my insight.
No.
And then in the diagnostic process, pretty much every doctor um, or anyone I spoke to in the various assessments I had, it was all just, "What's your mental health history?" I'm just like, well, this is going to take a while.
Strap in.
Can we focus on this ADHD thing?
Yeah.
And I remember one doctor said, surely they would have picked up on it in hospital. It's like they weren't really focusing on it back then. It was the whole making me eat and stay alive thing.
Yeah.
Also, ADHD isn't a mental illness.
No.
It's neurodivergence. It's your brain working in a slightly different way to a neurotypical person.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily something psychiatrists or therapists are that clued up about. because it's not technically in their realm of expertise.
Well, it's not a problem. So that's the thing, is it's not with something like bipolar, it's an imbalance. With something like an eating disorder, there's a core issue that led to that eating disorder. But with ADHD, it's a neurodivergence. So it's just your brain's way. It's like being left-handed or having green eyes. It's just a genetic build. That's how you're built. And you can't fix it. There's no like tablet they can give you. They've tried, and they just, all it does is it makes your brain do different things. But they can't.
Don't write it off completely, because that's I'm working with a nurse to go on to try medication.
Right. Okay.
Which I'm not. I'm medicated for my mental health issues anyway, and I'm no ADHD meds. They vary because most of them are stimulants.
Yes.
Which confuses a lot of people, because they think, aren't you hyperactive? Why would you want a stimulant? And it's not.
Yeah.
Again, that's not how it works. And honestly, I'm still learning very much about ADHD and my own brain, so I don't know all of the science behind it. But I felt, although we say ADHD isn't a problem necessarily, it feels like one.
And I
feel very restrained by it. Yeah. And when I first learned I might have it, at first it was such a relief, because like I said, there was an explanation for all of my pitfalls. And then after a while, it was like, oh, this is something I've got for the rest of my life. And I've got to navigate everything with ADHD in my head. And, like I mentioned before, I was academically successful as a kid. Then as a teenager, I got unwell and stopped achieving academically. And now I'm looking to finally go back to education to do mental health nursing and specialising in eating disorders and in LGBTQ plus patients. That's kind of where I want to specialise. And I've got to go back to education with ADHD, but also I've got a house, I've got a mortgage, I've got a dog, I've got to earn money, I've got to pay bills. So it's so much more of a woman than being in education as a child, because I've got this whole world of responsibilities on top of the idea of going into education again, and first going to college and then going to uni. And I thought, I'm barely scraping by as it is now. How on earth am I going to handle all of this plus education? And I felt like such a failure. I've already failed my eating disorder by being in recovery. I need to at least achieve academically to prove that I'm worth something. But can I do that with my current brain? Because it feels impossible. So if medication could potentially, it's like a walking aid, a mental walking aid. It wouldn't change it. It would just hopefully, if I get on with it, which not everyone else does, if I get on with medication, it would be like my mental walking stick.
Yes. And see, that's what I was meaning, is it is a problem. It's just going back to what I was saying. It's not like like you can't fix it with a pill, but you can take medication to control it. It's not like other things.
Hopefully, the way I see it is takes the edge off a bit.
That's it. I think of it as helping to deal. What it does is it's like a guide to this world, because this world is a neurotypical world, and everything in it is neurotypical. That is a neurodivergence, and the world is just not designed for it. But the medication they give you helps you deal with a neurotypical world, rather than it trying to correct a problem. It's trying to focus you towards a particular way of behaving that helps you. That's what I think.
Basic tasks a bit more accessible,
manageable. While everything is flashing around you, and like you say, those responsibilities, and existing within a world where you've got you want to have achievements, you want to have pets, you want to have a day-to-day life that's fairly normal with regards to everything else. And so medication on an ADHD level is for that. Is for helping you focus on those things and taking away the noise a bit, taking away.
Oh, that's such a good way of putting it. The way I kind of describe my brain especially if I'm overstimulated with sound, especially. My brain feels like a scribble.
Right. Yes. White noise is what I call it. Snow.
Yeah, and I'm hoping medication will maybe turn that scribble more into like a ball of wool rather than a knot.
Yeah.
But there's no way of me knowing if medication and which medication will or will not help me. It's kind of a very daunting process, to be honest. I am nervous about it.
Well,
especially because, and this has been a concern throughout all of my assessments in being diagnosed. A lot of ADHD medications can cause a loss of appetite.
right.
And that could be a bit of a wedge in my recovery, because even if I don't consciously restrict my diet, if I do start eating less and if I do possibly lose weight, although I don't weigh myself anymore, that can get that little voice going again.
Yeah.
Because I'm going, oh, we're eating less. Let's continue doing this. Let's turn it into a competition with ourselves. Let's take this weight gain just a little bit further. And it never is just a little bit. That is the horrible thing about eating disorders, because you can tell yourself, I'm just going to do it until X weight, for example.
Yeah.
Then you get there and you think, oh, you have a brief moment of elation where you've achieved it and you've got to your goal weight, like as an example. Then you're going to want to chase that again.
Yeah.
So if medication gets in the way of my eating disorder recovery, I will go without, because my eating disorder recovery is more important to me than my ADHD being treated, because ADHD is hard and it affects my mental health, but it doesn't affect me the way an eating disorder can.
It's not going to kill you, is it, there and then?
No, anorexia has the highest mortality rate of all mental illnesses. And now, this far along in my recovery, I can't think of anything worse than being like that again. It doesn't feel like me.
No.
My dad called me yesterday because so I put out 2 episodes of my podcast so far, my eating disorder recovery podcast, and my dad called to talk about it, having listened to them. And I said to him, when I'm talking about it, I do feel like I'm talking about someone else, just because I'm so far removed from it. Yeah. Even though it's obviously me, and obviously I can talk about it to death because I'm doing it here, I'm doing it on the podcast, I do it on my blog, it still doesn't feel like I'm talking about me, because it was like a whole other entity who went through that.
Yeah.
And my dad said, as someone who witnessed it, it's the same. Like, that was a whole different person that he knew back then compared to who I am now. And I really don't want to be her again.
No. I've said similar about slipping back into bipolar untreated when we were talking about it before. You feel like you're broken and you're still building yourself. People think that they come out fully formed, and whatever happens in those bad times is like breaking apart and coming together, when actually you're still being built. You're going to be a very different person now than you were 10 years ago. But also, I think one of the things that happens is we disassociate from those things. And when you at the time, and when you disassociate from them, your brain is almost not recording them, because it's just trying to do the rituals, just trying to do the things, and it's not remembering them. Like I'm asked, I was a stand-up comedian, and I was always asked to write jokes about anecdotes, and I didn't have that many anecdotes because my brain had just, I don't need that. That's not information I can keep.
Yeah, so, I can remember some really awful things happening at my own hand. And I can kind of visualize it, but it's still really, really separate. It's it's like I'm recounting someone else's experience.
Yeah, it's like a film you watched.
Yeah. And it's like I said, it's so alien now that I've come this far in my recovery. That's not to say in the last 6.5, 7 years I haven't had lapses, because there have been times when I have resorted back to some of my old restrictive behaviors, or my OCD has gotten a little bit worse again, or my mood has been more unstable. But it's never gone back to the extent it was before I started my eating disorder recovery and got on the right medication on a regular basis.
Yeah.
I'm such a huge advocate for medication. I know it's not for everyone. Some people get horrible side effects.
Yeah.
Some people want to, maybe they'll take it for a bit and then see how they can manage without it. That's not me. I cannot do that. If I come off of my medications, I won't stay well. And I know this is medication I'm going to have to take probably forever.
Yes.
And I had a doctor in the past when I had a medication review. He said, "Oh, you're doing well, so you should come off your meds." Why do you think I'm doing well?
Yeah, that's the reason.
Because I resisted medication for years because I was like, either I don't want to get better, so why would I take meds? Or if I'm going to get better, I need to do it off my own back.
Yeah.
So I know the vast difference between me unmedicated and me when I started taking my medication. And there is a direct correlation between me getting on my meds and my eating disorder recovery starting and sustaining. They are directly linked. And that's another stigma that kind of needs taking down, I think, because as someone with bipolar, you say it's a chemical thing.
Yeah.
And the medication treats that chemical. It's no different from having an underactive or an overactive thyroid, for example.
Yeah, you take the medication.
It's still physical. There is a physical element to it. And personality disorders are really taboo. BPD is the most known personality disorder. It's still got a lot of stigma, but at least people kind of know what it is. And for a long time, people say, "Oh, you can't treat personality disorders with medication," because it's almost like it's a fundamental flaw of who you are, not an illness. And I'm over here on my mood stabilizers, like, hi, I'm so much more stable now.
Yeah.
So I feel like I'm living proof that you can't fix BPD with medication.
No.
But it's another thing that's the edge has been taken off. I've been leveled out.
It's the walking cane. It's the walking stick. It's a wheelchair. It's just the mental version. Now, I've been ignoring the chat a little bit because we've been having a good conversation, but I'm just going to tell you what basically I want to say. They've been agreeing with you massively. A lot of people are saying there's a mood right here for you. Lots and lots of people agree with you. But there was a specific question. So I apologise if I have been ignoring in the chat, but you have all just been agreeing with Phoebe. So that's that's great. That's where we want to be. It's great that you're managing to relate to so many people. Someone here has asked, what are you taking the meds for? Are they for just the mood, or is it for your eating disorder, or what is it specific for?
I feel like they cover all bases, to be honest.
Okay.
Mental health wise, my medications don't treat ADHD. Like I said, I'm still I had a recent appointment with an ADHD specialist nurse to discuss that. But in terms of my antidepressant and my mood stabilizer, they both attack my three main diagnosed issues. So I feel like I could take one or the other. And they would do a bit, but the combination of them helps me to manage all three of my diagnosed disorders. And I don't know necessarily which medication does what to my brain and helps me with what aspect. But my OCD, my BPD, and my eating disorder have all been treated by medication.
Which is good. I think like you said, I think there's people that work with medication. There's people that work with therapy. I'm the other way. I took medication and it numbed me, like completely numbed me. Now, bipolar medication, and that was it was like 2003 at the time. Bipolar medication, they were still like unsure of what they needed to do. It was either like you were either going straight down and that was it. It was trank or nothing, basically. And they gave, and I just went numb. And it was about 2 years where I just nothing. And I said, I can't live like this. I'd rather the ups and downs. So now I manage it with therapy because, it's taken decades to be able to do that, and I have to
practice.
In a way. We were talking about masking earlier. Masking's a big thing for people like you and me. I mean, I'm going through an ADHD diagnosis, but it might not be. It might just be that my bits of my bipolar, or I might just be slightly distracted. It's very hard to know when you're 38 years old. But you obviously have had the diagnosis, and and I think I know as well that the exhaustion of masking, but it just becomes habit. It just becomes you're just walking out in the world and you've got that face on, and it's tough. So that's one of the things. So I think that the therapy just taught me how to mask a bit better rather than dealing with the issue directly.
Yeah, I mean, masking is something I do spend a lot of energy doing, because although it does become automatic, it's still draining.
Oh yeah, emotionally.
And for a while last year, I was working in social care with vulnerable teenagers. And although my employers knew bits of my history, I wasn't meant to let any of the residents in the social housing know that I had any of the issues they may well have been facing. And so it was just an extra thing to mask, in that I couldn't say, if one of them was struggling with self-harm, I couldn't say, I know how you feel because I've been there. I wasn't able to even say anything like that. And that's partially why that job didn't work out for me.
No, I can imagine.
It was just an extra level of faking it. And I'm so honestly, you can tell by this conversation, I'm so open about all of this. And it's so important to me to be open about this, morally, as well as the fact I don't have the energy to shut up. Basically.
It's so hard to be quiet, but and on the same, I went from being not talking about it at all to just like almost immediately. Like if sometimes I just say, sorry, I'm a bit weird. You won't get it. I'm bipolar. Don't worry about it. And it's just a different way of thinking. But people don't realize how draining it is. For me, after a day of being like trying to be someone else or trying to mask a low mood, because when you're high, for me, it's great. You get out there and it's great. But when you're trying to mask a low mood, it's the way I described it to someone was if you've ever cried for 2 or 3 hours or shivered.
Oh God, yeah.
Or if you've had flu and you've shivered for so long, and you get home and it's like your body's just a sack, and you can't. But they don't realise that. It's very hard to explain when they can't physically see anything about you.
Yeah, and I didn't really. I spent a long time trying to find the words for that, and it turns out the word is burnout. And I didn't know you could get burnout from emotions rather than, overexerting yourself physically. Turns out, masking some of my more visible ADHD and mental illness symptoms, and like I told you earlier, I have tics as well, and sometimes I have to really strain my body to not tick. It's kind of like if you've got a sneeze brewing and you have to stop it. That's kind of what it is like to prevent a tic. And so I've only been working until I was furloughed. I was working in a cafe. It wasn't exactly high stakes, but there was still an element of masking in that job. And I was just so lucky at this particular location that I've got colleagues who are mentally or neurodivergent themselves. So luckily, in this instance, I've been able to be like, this is where I'm at today. I might struggle with this, that. Whereas, when I've worked in retail before, I've been told by managers, you're too obviously depressed.
Too obviously depressed.
Can you stop, can you put on a smile for the customers? It's like,
That is, geez. Talk about 1950s work environments. Come on, smile more.
Just like, leave your depression at home.
I'd love to, mate. Absolutely love to, so that I could deal with this just normally. But
then that's why I can sell as many products as possible. As long as I'm smiling, then we can, here we can talk about how mental illness and capitalism can collide, but I'm sure we'd be here for hours. That's a whole other thing.
Someone's like laughing in the chat, like hide your illness, please. They wouldn't do it to someone in a wheelchair, or they wouldn't be like
They might. There's been a lot. There's a lot of discourse online about from people who have physical disabilities saying can you stop saying that we need to treat mental illnesses like physical illnesses, because a lot of us don't get treated
Yes. No.
Appropriately if we are physically ill, and especially people in larger bodies get dismissed from all sorts of terrible physical illnesses, and the doctors will just say lose weight and it will be fixed, and that's not how it is.
No.
So we can't say we're not being treated as well as those with physical illnesses, because they're also being treated terribly.
They're also being mistreated. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was being flippant. I apologise for that. But that's, it's when it's more visible. I've always said that I would prefer a big blue lump on the side of my face that glowed when I was sad, just so people were more aware of it. But I obviously don't mean that. It's a very
no. I know. I know.
I'm just being.
I can't shut up. Like I just said.
No, don't apologise for that. Don't say that. But it's absolutely fine. That's the whole point of the chat. And also, people are talking as well and saying. So people are saying you're absolutely right, Phoebe. They don't treat anyone right. That's the problem. Is that no one. You have to be literally a man and healthy and in your mid-20s. If you're none of those things, you're not allowed to be. It doesn't cater to you.
There's a quote that really alludes to that. That's like, I'm a male between 25 and 40. Everyone takes everything I say seriously, or something along those lines.
Yeah. Well, exactly.
Yeah, pretty much.
As long as you're healthy. That's, oh God. But yeah, so we've come through all that. We know what's. You've got these things. You've gone through therapy. You've gone through. You're going through a diagnosis at the moment for ADHD. You've been diagnosed, but you're going through medical. You're going to medications. You've obviously learning to live with your things. What would you say to people who would ask you? So someone comes to you. They say they've got very similar problems, very similar issues. What would you say to them that might help them? What would be your top advice or
I don't want to say things that seem really small, but that's what worked for me. So that's really all I can advise, is that to remember the reasons in those moments where you want to get better.
Yeah,
you've got to hold on to those moments, because a lot of, especially with eating disorders, and when you've lived with it for so long, or even you don't have to have lived with it for that long. One of the biggest hurdles in recovery is wanting to change in the first place.
Yes.
Because your eating disorder serves a purpose. It's not just there. It gives you multiple things, and it's a coping mechanism, which is why it can be so scary, the idea of leaving it behind.
Right.
And
yes.
At first, you may, 90% of the time, you're adamant on remaining unwell with your eating disorder. But if 10% of the time you are wishing you could be better, hold on to those moments, and they will increase. That's a huge thing for me. And also believing you are permitted to be better and that you don't deserve to remain unwell. It's holding on to those beliefs and developing them until you build that permission to be healthier and to look after yourself. And the fact that recovery, you don't decide to recover on one occasion. I've been doing this for over 6 years, and I still make that recovery decision multiple times a day. And making that decision right now is pretty easy, but it's still a decision to be made. And in the earlier stages, when there's so much you need to do in eating disorder recovery as well, because of how it affects you physically. That decision can be really hard to make.
Yes.
But like I just said, I find that decision quite easy now, and it will get easier. And it might get harder at first. I'm not going to lie to you. Recovery is a rough path. But you have to keep remembering that it does get better. I know it sounds so corny, and people don't believe it could ever get better. But with every decision you make, every meal, every snack, every time you decide not to over-exercise, every time you decide not to binge or restrict and find that middle ground, that's a little closer to it being easier, even if you have to go through the rougher bit first. I can't tell anyone what to eat to recover from their eating disorder, and I can't tell everyone you should be on this particular medication because it worked for me. It's so individual, and that goes for people with all sorts of mental health problems and neurodivergence. And it is very much a matter of finding who you are and what works for you, and it's kind of an experiment. But it's an experiment to be embraced, and it can be really interesting as well, especially for me. Like, I learned that I liked certain foods I hadn't eaten in a long time, or my mind's gone blank now in a typical ADHD fashion. But yeah, you discover things about yourself and you start filling that void. And
as you said about your hobbies, you've started to enjoy hobbies again.
This is, my ADHD has really clouded my ability to enjoy like recreational activities. But you've got capacity to be interested in other things that don't revolve around food and your body and your weight and everyone else's perception of you. Or even just, you get some amazing thirsts in recovery as well. Like, I can only speak as someone who's in recovery from anorexia, and I can't say this for everyone of any diagnosis, but having a coffee that wasn't made with skimmed milk for the first time, how exciting is that? It was so much more delicious. Or like, I remember the first time I had a slice of cake in a cafe ever when I was 21, and I think I cried, but also not with the anxiety at that point, but with the overwhelming joy I got out of it. The recovery firsts are amazing, and the first, you can only have your firsts one time.
That's true.
And so now sometimes recovery can feel a bit like a long slog. So I've done the exciting things, and now it's not so exciting. It just feels like a job, which it can be sometimes, but yeah, it gives you that capacity to fill your life with other things, and then that's where you realize all that effort was worth doing.
Yes. See, that's a nice thing. The capacity to do other things and worth doing. I love that. What a great message. And I think that people forget that that's the next bit. The next bit is you, little by little, just the little one-offs makes it worth it, and then you get there. And those are the little victories along the way. So where can they find you, Phoebe? We've talked about all of these things. Where can people find you if they want to hear more from you?
Okay, so I've got a relatively sparse blog at the moment. It is Phoebe Webb blog, so PhoebeWebbblog @wordpress.com.
Okay.
And then my new eating disorder recovery podcast, Not About Food, is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Anchor. Because it's new and with the algorithm, you may not be able to find it straight away, but it is under Not About Food. On Spotify, you should be able to find it if you also put EDAW in the search. Alternatively, I am on Twitter as Philo, so that's FEEHLO, and then I've got the link to the podcast in my bio as well, and it's the same on Instagram. So you can see me prattling nonsense on there and also listen to the podcasts. And hopefully we'll get another episode out this week. We did 2 last week for Eating Disorders Awareness Week. And now it's just a matter of finding the right guests and my long-suffering brother having to do all the editing, because I have no idea.
That's fair. That's what I'd love to have someone to send it over to. And when we do put out, because we're going to put this as a podcast, I'll make sure that all the links are in there as well, so people will be able to just click on things and find you easily. And if you are watching the show and and you didn't write that all down, I have shared Phoebe's Twitter in my Twitter, so that you'll be able to just click on it and go and find all your stuff.
Yep. I'm on your Instagram as well.
And on my Instagram as well, because I am a social media maniac, like you say. Yeah. Right. Okay. Thank you very much for coming on the show. Phoebe, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk through those very difficult topics to cover, and I think we've done. I mean, the people in the chat are very happy with you saying how much they relate to what you've been saying. So that's lovely. So thank you very much for joining us, everyone. There, we'll be back next week for another mental health bar. You've been Phoebe Webb. Thank you very much for joining us, and I will see everyone on Wednesday. Thank you very much.
Awesome.